Welcome to Layer the Alchemist, where we discuss all things heavy metal and hard rock. On today's episode, another in my series of milestone moments. These are moments and albums in a band's career that sets them off into the stratosphere, that maybe even helps define a genre of music. So, the album that we are going to be discussing today is Rush's 1976 epic 2112. And for an album this monumental, I had to call in some backup. So, joining me here today is my very special guest, Pete Pardo from the Sea of Tranquility YouTube channel and webpage. Pete's laid back conversational style and immense knowledge and passion for rock and all its subgenres has propelled Sea of Tranquility to 58,000 subscribers and growing daily. On a personal note, Pete's channel is what influenced me to start Layer of the Alchemist. So I'm very excited and grateful to have him here with me today. So Pete, thank you so much for joining me here at the Layer.
No, you're very welcome, John. Happy to be here. And thanks for all the kind words. Yeah, it's been an interesting ride so far. So love what I do. This is a passion of mine. And I'm happy that I've inspired you to start up your own thing here. And it's growing too. So, and I'm very happy to come on here and talk some music with you, especially Rush, a band I love a lot. So.
Yeah, and I know, and you are the professor of prog. So I knew when when I asked you to come on the show, I've been waiting to do Rush 2112, and I thought, all right, this is the perfect time. Pete knows so much about prog, so this is really going to be great. So, all right, so let's set the table. Rush's 2112. It's their fourth studio album. Comes out in 1976. The band at this point, they're a little bit on the ropes. Caress of Steel, the album that came out before this, wasn't very well received by the critics, didn't sell a whole lot. The record label wants to drop them. They convinced the label to give them one more shot. The band, sort of on their own, doesn't even let their manager know. They go into the studio and they say, all right, instead of trying to put out a radio friendly record, they decide that if they're going to go out, they're going to go out by their own terms. And they put out 2112. And then this launches their career for them. So Pete, what are your thoughts on 2112? What are your early memories of hearing this album for the first time?
Well, I mean, it's an interesting album because, like, I mean, you set it up perfectly for me here. I mean, this album was, this is the make or break album for them. And the label wanted an album with hits or more commercial stuff on it, because obviously Caress of Steel is anything but that. And the band was just kind of like, you know what? We're just going to go do the best album we can. And they basically did Caress of Steel Part 2. So the funny thing is like the general public and the radio stations ignored Caress of Steel because it's so heavy and uncommercial and progressive and whatnot. And they basically turned around and did the exact same thing, yet everybody picked up on this. And everybody loved this, and myself included. So my first introduction to Rush was ironically the live album, All the World's a Stage, which, as you know, it contained, the 2112 epic on here, as well as some other tracks. And I mean, this is a fantastic album. This is, at the time, there really wasn't this thing called progressive metal. And Rush is like an interesting band because they're not really heavy metal and they're kind of not really prog rock, but they're kind of like the perfect blend of the two at the time anyway. So we're looking at mid 70s here. I mean, this album is really heavy. It's really complex. You've got these sci-fi lyrics. It's just very like different stuff. And I think an absolute trailblazer for them. Not that Caress of Steel wasn't. And, as we would soon see, you have A Farewell to Kings and Hemispheres, which even took this to another level. But I think this is really the album that launched them into the eyes of a lot more people. And those people who realized that, maybe Yes fans all of a sudden are starting to notice this band. Maybe Genesis fans are starting to notice this band, but fans who like Led Zeppelin and Black Sabbath and Deep Purple are also saying, hey, this is pretty good. Who is this Canadian band, this three-piece making this big, loud, complicated noise, right? But I mean, I think this also, and I've told this story lots of times on my channel, it's like, I'm like not much of a lyric guy. I generally, when I listen to albums and bands, I'm more of listening to the riffs and the arrangements and all that kind of stuff, and getting into the vocals, but not really a sit down and, read along to the lyrics to the songs while I'm listening to it. But I did it with this band
Mhm.
because this band, was one of the few back in the day. Kansas was another one who were really writing some just like, I loved like fantasy and sci-fi books when I was a kid. That's what I read. I was a big Tolkien guy, Robert E. Heinlein, all that kind of stuff. And reading along to Rush lyrics was like reading a sci-fi or a fantasy book. And then you had the music, which is so complex and just kind of out there based on what we were getting at the time, that you couldn't help but not love these guys. And I think that's why a lot of people in my age group who have such fond memories of listening to Rush in the 70s into the early 80s look back on this period as this really fruitful time in their career where they were just doing some really different stuff. Not that the 80s music and beyond wasn't, but there was something about 70s Rush that was just really, really special. And, this album, with the sidelong title suite, doesn't get much better than that, right? It's heavy, it's complicated, it's bombastic and epic. It's like it tells a story. It's almost like watching a film, but instead of seeing anything, you're just actually hearing it, right? So I mean, I have very fond memories of kind of growing up to this album, and the couple that came before it and the ones after it. It's a really, really special time in my life to look back on it. And I think a lot of people feel that way. And I think you have a couple songs on here, right? Besides the 2112 title track, you got A Passage to Bangkok, right? Something for Nothing. I mean, these are songs that have kind of stood the test of time all throughout the decades. And then you got the couple of other tracks that kind of sit in this album here as well, that also are part of the whole, package, so to speak, that you can't take any of these songs off this album. They all have to be, even though it's not like a lot of people say that, oh, but 2112 is one of the greatest concept albums of all time. It really isn't. The concept is in the sidelong title track.
Yeah.
The rest of the songs don't really have anything to do with that, but it's one of those albums where every track has its place. You can't take one off and pull it out of here. You have to listen to this whole album together because it goes so well together.
Yeah. I remember my first exposure to Rush was Moving Pictures. And then I got my second Rush album was 2112. And I remember at the time, this is 80, 81, I was listening to, Black Sabbath, Heaven and Hell, and Ozzy, Blizzard of Oz. So I was a metalhead hard rocker. And I love the Moving Pictures, but when I heard 2112, I was able to really relate to it because there's a lot of power chords on this album. There's a lot of riffing. Not that there aren't riffs on Moving Pictures, but Moving Pictures is a little more textural at times. There's more keyboards on Moving Pictures. The guitar, it has, it has its moments on Moving Pictures. It's there on Moving Pictures. But when I heard 2112, I was really able to relate that to the metal that I was listening to at the time. I was like, wow, okay, here, this is like just guitar, a lot of heavy riffing. Uh, like you
Even the
said,
solos, the guitar solos are just screaming, right? I mean,
yeah, his guitar tone on it. And, speaking of that, the production on the record, I love Caress of Steel. I love Fly By Night. The production on those albums, though, it's a little bit boxy, a little bit. Here on 2112, it seems to have come together for me production wise. And really from this point, forward, the production would just keep getting better and better. But for me, 2112 is where it really kind of comes together. It's not a super complex recording. It's not like there's a million things going on. Like you said, it's as far as layers of instruments. You've got the guitar, you've got the bass. Really, the only keyboards on this are the intro to 2112.
that's it. Yeah.
Right. And I was trying to think right as we were getting ready to do this, I was thinking to myself, is that the first time there were keyboards
That's the first appearance of synths on a Rush album. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So,
Yeah, this
uh,
album is not as meticulous as they would get with the next album, Farewell to Kings and Hemispheres. I mean, if you read any of the various Rush books, they talk quite a bit about how after like Hemispheres, they were like, all right, we're exhausted of being in the studio for months on end, really just getting so granular about everything that they wanted to kind of strip things back a little bit. And you hear that on, the two albums that come right after, and certainly moving forward until like the mid 80s, they started to get back into all those multi layers and things. But yeah, this album is like, it's all about the riffs, and there are lots of textures and, little more complexities compared to Caress of Steel and Fly By Night. But yeah, it's definitely a little more stripped down than the two albums that came after it. But this was kind of the arrival of
yeah,
that Rush. I mean, and
yeah.
there was kind of no turning back after this.
And you can kind of see how this album has been so influential for metal bands because, like I mentioned, it's pretty heavy at times, and there's a lot of riffing, there's a lot of guitar. And so here's a question I have for you because I know how well you know prog. I mean, what else at this time was progressive like this and as heavy as this?
I mean, not a lot. So, you had other bands and albums who were doing. I'll use Black Sabbath as an example. So Sabbath, obviously we know Sabbath, the originators of what we know as doom and stoner and all that kind of stuff. Really heavy band, but more simple plodding, dirgy type of stuff. But with their like Sabbath Bloody Sabbath album and certainly Sabotage, all of a sudden starting to do more progressive, complicated things. The arrangements are, multi-layered. They're overdubbing quite a bit of things and what have you. So that's kind of treading somewhat in this kind of area a little bit. You could say like, yes, with the Relayer album is doing music a little bit more aggressive, certainly much more complex, bringing in some jazz fusion influences and what have you. But I don't think any other band at the time, we're looking 75, 76, that is doing anything this metallic. I mean, how about those vocals? Those high pitched
Yeah,
vocals. I mean,
he
not even
is really up there for a lot of this record. He is
he's
just
way up there. I mean,
way
not
up
even
there.
Robert
Yeah.
Plant is doing that type of stuff, right? So this is taking that to another level. That drumming, I mean, Neil Peart, nobody's playing drums like that at this time period.
Yeah.
That bass, I mean, again, Geddy, big fan of Chris Squire from Yes. He's kind of taken that lead bass style to another level, really up front in the mix. I mean, we could talk about Lifeson all day, but these are some rampaging heavy riffs on here. The solos are absolutely monstrous. The acoustic guitar work is just gorgeous. So, I would say maybe you can talk a little bit about Rainbow at the same time. Rainbow
Yeah, maybe
Rising,
Rainbow
when
Rising.
Neil
Yeah.
was in the band. I mean, there's some progressive things going on there, but maybe that's more kind of the birth of power metal and not so much progressive metal. But I mean, this is pretty advanced for the time. They took their prog influence because the guys in the band, they loved Genesis and Yes and Gentle Giant and Jethro Tull. They loved all Pink Floyd. They loved all that stuff. But this is like on a different plane from that. This is just, they're taking their love of heavy music. And again, the band loved Zeppelin and Cream and The Who. Those were like their favorite heavy bands. And they're kind of putting those two styles together, but yet it's taken the heaviness to a new level. And so this, I would argue that these couple of albums, I'd include Caress of Steel too. Caress of Steel, this album, Farewell to Kings and Hemispheres, is, if you're going to kind of point to a genesis of progressive metal, you got to point to these albums and this band. You kind of have to.
Yeah. And what I love about 2112, the side one of the record, it's 20 minutes long, but it moves by very quickly. It's very catchy. It doesn't feel like it's bogged down and just like extended solos or anything like that. It moves along really well. The story is somewhat easy to follow. You can kind of grasp, what's going on. The overture is great because it's sort of these themes that you hear in the overture reappear at various points as the song progresses. And it's a cool storyline, you know. And amazingly, you usually don't hear all of 2112 on classic rock radio, but you'll hear the overture and Temples of Syrinx on classic rock radio to
That,
this
yeah.
day. So you know that's like really cool, and that's what a lot of people remember from this. You know that the first part of it, but
Yeah, and I think too, if you kind of talking about the concept thing. So even though 2112 album as a whole is not a full-blown concept album, let's just take a look at the side one of the LP, right? The 2112 suite. I mean, you have that as an extended concept piece. You've got Tales from Topographic Oceans. You've got Tommy, Quadrophenia, right? The very famous kind of concept pieces or albums from that time period. Do you get like Operation Mindcrime or Dream Theater's
yeah,
Scenes from a Memory or any of these other like progressive metal or heavy metal or progressive rock concept albums, especially the ones with these kind of really intricate science fiction, like space age stories behind them, if you don't have 2112 and some of these other pieces from the 70s? I don't know. I mean, you have to think 2112 is a huge influence on all that stuff that we now, I mean, is pretty commonplace, right? Progressive metal bands come up with these intricate fantasy or sci-fi concept pieces all the time now. And you have to think that 2112, the title track, the sidelong suite, is hugely influential to all that stuff.
yeah, and the whole sci-fi thing too. I mean, not that no one else ever talked about that, but I don't know if anybody quite did it the way that they did it here. A lot of the progressive bands, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, before this, like Yes and those bands, they weren't really diving this deep into the whole sci-fi thing. And that would be something that would it be a little bit of a trademark for Rush, you know, like on it, like Cygnus X1 and stuff like that, you know, where that would be part of their thing, would sort of be this really intellectual sci-fi. It just fit with Rush, with Neil Peart's lyrics. It all works here, and it flows so well, you know, from beginning to end. It goes by so quick. I love the way it builds. The whole thing at the end with the attention all planets of the Solar Federation, we have assumed control. I mean, that is just like one of the coolest, like, you know, epic endings, you know, ever. So it's just a great album. And then, like you mentioned, you know, side two of it, Passage to Bangkok. That's another like Life's in Cool riff. You know, very melodic, catchy song. Great lyrics. You could just you sing along with it. Then you got kind of the mellower ones like Lessons and Tears. And then you got probably the heaviest song on side two, Something for Nothing. You know, Getty way up there, the band jamming out, Life's in, you know, soloing out and going crazy. So it's just a great album from beginning to end. And like you said, it all flows so well, and it really sets sort of you know, sets in motion. It isn't like it came out of nowhere for Rush, because like you said, they were building up to this with Fly By Night and Caress of Steel, and it was all leading to this, but it all just seemed to sort of crystallize and come together on this one. So it's easy to understand how influential this album is, not only for progressive rock, but you know, for progressive metal, because the reasons, like we mentioned already, how much guitar is on this, and the riffing and the power chords all over this record. So
Yeah, and it's interesting how, and again, I think if we were to stack the songs up next to each other, we can see the kind of difference there. But you have this long 2112 song, which is, what is it, 20 minutes? I forget
yeah,
exactly how long,
it's like, I think
20, just over 20, right? Something like that. And then you had on the previous album, you have the Necromancer and the Fountain of Lamneth, right? Both long pieces, but most folks don't like talk about those two tracks as fondly as this one. Then you have Bytor and the Snow Dog, which is also pretty long. And I think people probably, they like that song, but it's just interesting how Rush just kind of stuck to their guns. And they're like, we're going to keep doing this epic shit because that's what we like. That's what we do. And they continue that on the next couple of albums, right? Until I think they finally got it out of their system, right? I think, after, you can only do that so many times, right? But, and if you read the interviews with the band, they were kind of like, all right, we're ready to move on to like shorter pieces. The 80s came in and all that kind of stuff. And you kind of had to, right? But yeah, it's just, when you really look back on it, it's amazing how this really struck a chord with so many people, whereas the albums that came before it, you know, kind of struggled a little bit. And it's really not that much different. I think maybe the songwriting craft is a little bit catchier,
Yeah.
I guess, because it's really not a very accessible album either. But
No,
there's
as I said, it's amazing that the song that gets played the most on classic rock radio is the overture in Temples of Syrinx.
I know,
That's
right?
like,
Which is go figure. But
yeah,
it's something about it, you know, something, you know, right place, right time. You know, there's all sorts of stories about certain radio stations playing their music at this time. You know, I think like Cleveland, Ohio was like a big spot for them. And sometimes it just takes a DJ in a, you know, again, we're going back a ways. In the 70s is much different than radio today. And a lot of you know, local rock radio stations, FM rock radio stations, were not afraid to play new songs, new albums from kind of unknown bands, because that's how you got broke back in the day. And if you were lucky enough to befriend or find a DJ who liked your music and, you know, really played your stuff a lot in their rotation, could make or break a band. And that really helped Rush quite a bit back in the day.
yeah. And you also get the iconic red star on the
Oh yeah, the album
inside of
cover
the
is great.
jacket here. You know, you got the guy in the star, and that would become, you know, an iconic symbol for
Yep.
Rush. So just a great milestone, iconic album all around. So any final thoughts on 2112, Pete?
No, I mean, it's funny because I like this album a lot. It's, you know, God, I've done so many shows like talking about favorite Rush albums and Rush songs and all that stuff. And, you know, generally speaking, and you mentioned a little bit earlier. So even though I was listening to Rush before Moving Pictures came out, and I really liked them a lot, Moving Pictures like kind of like changed my perception for this band, because it took a lot of what I loved from this album and Hemispheres and the Farewell to Kings and Fly By Night, and obviously the first album too, and Permanent Waves, and it kind of made it, I don't know what it was, more anthemic, a little more accessible. I mean, I just got completely swept up with Moving Pictures. And I think that album made me even appreciate the albums that came before it even more. And I will say, I mean, this is a top 5 Rush album for me. I know for a lot of people, it probably ranks a little higher. I love it. I think it's from a magical time in their discography that I will forever be a complete fan of. So yeah, it's they were a game changer band and really groundbreaking. We talked a lot today about some of the reasons why, but such an important band. And if you're someone who has been listening to them for a long time, and what's really funny is when you talk to people who came in at different points during the
Yeah,
Rush history. I mean, I know a lot of people who did not listen to 70s Rush, and they came in with Signals and Power Windows and Grace Under Pressure and Hold Your Fire and all those albums. And to them, that's the real Rush. And this stuff is kind of like, that's really progressive and kind of heavy. I like the 80s stuff better. And I know a lot of people who listen, you know, worship the early stuff and don't like the 80s stuff and beyond. So, but I mean, I've been following them for long enough that I appreciate all of their eras. I have a fondness for this era, but I can listen to all Rush and, you know, brings a smile on my face, and the warm and fuzzies kind of go all throughout my body. So
yeah. All right, so there you go. Let us know in the comments down below what everybody out there thinks of Rush's 2112. I'd like to thank Pete for joining me here at the Lair. Thank you very much.
thanks for having me.
And until we see you again, we have assumed control. We have assumed control.